Educator with Cooperative Extension here in Saratoga County, New York. I am a certified master food preserver, and I've been teaching home food preservation for about 20 years. So anytime you have any questions about food preservation, you can contact me through email. I'll give you my contact information later, but you got an email from me today, so you have that. And I should mention that everybody should have gotten an email from me. If it went, you might check. I have the handouts in there for you. So I sent you 2 handouts. So if you didn't see that, you can look for that. I'm not sure if you joined today from my email or if when you registered, you got a link to join. But either way, you should have 2 handouts that came in an email from me today. Okay, and yes, I have Nicolina Foti, who works with me here at Cooperative Extension. She's an agriculture educator. She's helping me here today with the camera. I have so I'm going to switch over to my other camera and start with the meat. But I just want you to know that already you can see behind my right shoulder here, you can see my canner. I already have the water in the canner, about 2 inches of water in the canner. I already have it preheated because it takes a while to get it. So you want the water, you don't want it boiling in there, but you want it, the canner preheated just so that once I put the filled jars in the canner, it'll get up to temperature faster if I have all that preheated. And also notice I have the lid on there. One time we had a problem because as we were preheating the canner, the lid wasn't on, and the metal actually expands as it heats. And so they were expanding at different rates, and we had a hard time getting the lid on. So when you're preheating, keep the lid on there. So I'll be bouncing back and forth to different areas as we go along, but I'm going to start over and we're going to get the meat ready for canning. So that would be the USB. Oh, got it right on the meat. The smell.
Do you want it just the meat or you as a whole?
You can zoom out.
Okay. Yep.
So I bought some sirloin steak today, and I'm just gonna, one thing you wanna do is cut off all the excess fat, because fat does not preserve very well. Whether you're talking about canning or freezing or drying, fat doesn't preserve real well. This is 2 pounds of meat, and it takes about a pound per pint of, or a pint per pound of meat. So if you've got, 20 pounds of meat, you're going to make sure you've got 20 canning jars. So, and I'm going to cut it up into, you can cut it up into either cubes or slices. This meat is pretty, it's not real highly marbled, so it's good. Now there's 2 methods of canning meat. One is called the raw pack, where you just put raw meat into the canning jar, and the other is the hot pack, where you have to cook the meat first. So I'm going to do both here today so that you can see the difference. Get some of that meat off. If you were doing a wild game like venison, you might want to, the directions recommend, it's not necessary, but if in order to get rid of some of the stronger flavors, they recommend soaking the venison in a brine, a salt and water solution, for about an hour. And you don't want to do it for more than an hour. A lot of times we think if a little bit's good, a lot is better, but just 1 hour to get out that gamey flavor. So if you've done any canning this year, you might know that canning jars are, well, the jars themselves aren't too hard to come by, but what's been hard to come by this year is canning lids. When you're canning, you can reuse your jars and you can reuse your rings, but you can't reuse the lids. So I wonder if anybody's had a hard time finding lids. I have, especially the ball lids. Part of it last year, because of with COVID, so many people were home and people were taking up canning, so people were buying and people were trying to do, preparing for emergencies. And that is one of the advantages of canning meat, is that in an emergency situation where you can't cook, you already have pre-cooked meat, because obviously when you're canning it, it is pre-cooked. Another advantage is, let's say you've got meat in your freezer still now from last year, and if you're a hunter, you might be going out and getting another deer, hopefully, and then you'll need freezer space. So any meat that you have in your freezer, you can take it out of your freezer and you can defrost it and then can it, and that will free up some freezer space. Canning also helps to make meat really tender. So a lot of people really, I know some people, that's all they do with their venison, is they always can it. And then I know other people that all they do is they make jerky with all their meat. Did you?
Certain things you can't do with the meat after it's been canned?
Certain things you can't do with it?
Like take it out and throw it in a stew, like make.
Yeah, you can use it in stews or soups, and yeah, you just won't have to cook it much because it's already pre-cooked. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you see the chat there? Just put in the chat box if you're having a problem hearing me. Okay.
Yes, they're good.
Everybody's good. Okay, good. Yeah, so since the meat is pre-cooked, when you have canned meat, you got a quick meal, because a lot of times that's what takes the longest in making a meal is cooking the meat. All right, trying to get more of this fat off here. One of the issues with the fat is that during the canning process, air is coming out of the jar. That's what's going to create a vacuum seal, so that you've got a good seal and your meat is canned. But as that air is coming out, if you've got a lot of fat in there, the fat can come out with it, and that could interrupt the seal, so that you have what we call a seal failure. Your jars don't seal, and your canning process was useless if your jars don't seal. So I'm trying to get most of this fat off. I know people who buy meat when it's on sale. If you see chicken at a really low price in the grocery store, you can come home and can it and take advantage of those sale prices. Or then there's other people who have a relationship with a farmer, and they might buy a half a cow or something. You got lots of meat, and you don't have room in your freezer for all that meat. So that's another advantage of canning. Let's see.
How long does it keep for?
The question was, how long does canned meat keep for? All canned food will be safe indefinitely. So from a safety factor, as long as the seal is good, the meat will be safe. From a quality standpoint, for all home preserved or home canned foods, we recommend using it within a year for quality. issues.
Are there any other advantages of canning over freezing?
It does, once it's canned, you're not using any energy to store it, as opposed to freezing. When you freeze something, you've got to use energy constantly to keep it frozen, right? Okay, that was it. All right, I've got to get my, I'm going to go over and get my jars. I've got all my meat cut up here. So I've got my jars preheating. Usually what you want to do is you want to have, because your canner is hot, you want your jars preheated so that you're not taking cold jars and putting them in a hot canner. That just might shock them and break the jar. So I do have my jars in the canner. I'm going to go over and get those. And I'll put this on to start cooking.
Go to film you getting your jars out.
That's all right. Okay, so I'm preheating my pan here because I'm going to show you, I'm just going to brown up some of this. So I have 2 jars here. One jar I'm going to do hot pack, and one jar I'm going to do raw pack. So I'll do raw pack first. I am going to add a ½ teaspoon of salt. Salt is completely optional. It is not in there for food safety at all. So if the recipe calls for ½ teaspoon per pint, a teaspoon per quart. If you wanted to do a quarter teaspoon to make it like reduced sodium, you could definitely do that. And I am using a canning and pickling salt. And the advantage of the canning and pickling salt is that it has no anti-caking agents. I don't know if you remember the commercial when it, with Morton salt, when it rains, it pours. And the reason for that is because that salt, most table salt, does have an anti-caking agent in it. And that will make your, make the broth cloudy. That's the only issue with that. And the iodine in table salt could discolor the meat or anything else that you're canning. So that's why canning and pickling salt is pure. It's just sodium chloride, nothing extra added. Okay, so for the raw pack, I'm just taking an empty jar. I've got the salt in there, and I'm going to put the meat in. You might be asking why I have this pan here. Actually, I have some hot water in here too, and that's to help keep this jar warm while I'm filling it. So I just want to loosely, I don't want to pack this meat in, but and I want to leave a ½ inch headspace. So to pack it in, this is a tip I read was that if you just, sometimes people want to really push down and pack it in there. You don't want to do that. If you pack it too much, it's not going to heat properly. And it could be a food safety issue because the heat has to penetrate through there. And your canning times are determined by kind of the density of what's in your jar. So if you pack it in, you might get more in there. You might be tempted to do that, but it could actually be a food safety issue. So just either pound it on there, pound it on your hand until you get, and I know that at the top of this rim here, that's an inch. That's a 1 inch space there. So, and I'm always tempted, we're always tempted to put a little more in.
I have a question. Is kosher salt an okay substitute?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. Somebody asked if kosher salt is an okay substitute. And the answer is not really, no, because, well, you can use kosher salt because it is pure salt. It is sodium chloride, that's all it is. But it's the way, it's a flaked salt instead of a ground salt. Regular table salt and the canning salt is ground, and it affects how it's measured. So for this, actually, for canning meat, because the salt is not even a safety factor, you could use the kosher salt and not worry about it. I'm thinking more for fermented foods where the salt is a real safety factor and you want to use the correct amount of salt, then you would want to use a measurement instead of, or a weight, you'd want to weigh the salt. There's actually conversion tables for converting the measurement in teaspoons from going from regular table salt or canning salt to kosher salt.
You want to take your mic and just put it up here? There's a little rustling from your side.
Okay, is that better? Now I've got this jar filled with the meat. It calls for 1 inch of headspace, so I can use a ruler like this to make sure I've got 1 inch headspace. And then there's these little tools, that a canning tool that's got little 1/4 inch notches, so we can use that too. And then the jar lids, the new lids don't require heating, so they just, the directions say just to wash them. So what I did, I want to make sure everybody noticed, I took a little bit of hot water from my pan here, put it on a paper towel, and I wiped the rim so that there's nothing on there, there's not even any pieces of fat on there. And then I'll just put the top on and the screw band. Now, when you're putting the screw band on, it's really important not to make it too tight. So when I put this screw band on, I just turned it with my fingers until it stopped naturally, and then I just gave it maybe just a slight more turn. It's what we like to call fingertip tight, because during the canning process, we want air to come out of that jar, and if you have it on too tight, the air won't come out.
So we have a question here that says they agree the whole trying to find lids is kind of a pain. They found some at an Amish store, but they had a note saying, be sure not to over tighten the ring. Do you have any feedback on the non-ball brands?
I'm going to go over here and cook this meat. I did use another non-ball brand. Yeah, we have had experience with more seal failures with kind of the off brands. So if that's all you got, that's all you got. But why did they, what they said, not to over tighten the lid? Is that what they said? Yeah. Not to over tighten, yeah, okay. People do have that tendency to try to, really tighten it before they put it in the jar. But like I said, during the canning process, there's air that has to come out of the jar. That's what creates a vacuum seal, is you're creating an anaerobic environment in canning. So, and if you tighten it too much, that air can't come out, and you wouldn't get a vacuum seal, so your jars just wouldn't seal. All right, so I'm just browning the meat. It just has to be cooked to the raw stage, or rare stage, not raw, obviously, the rare stage. The advantages of the hot pack, and I'll go over this more during my presentation, but it does like shrink the meat. You know how food kind of shrinks down as you cook it. It's also going to cook off some extra fat, although there's not much fat in this meat at all. I'm using a nonstick pan here, so I didn't add any oil. You could also roast the meat if you had a lot of meat and you wanted to roast it in the oven. You could do that. Cook it any way that you want, really. Now, this recipe doesn't call for any added herbs but if you wanted to, you could, you know, in your canning jar, you could add a little, like maybe 1 clove of garlic. That wouldn't affect things in any negative way. You'd get that nice flavor. Sometimes, you know, we tell you not to fool around with the recipe too much as far as adding different things. But if you wanted to add a clove of garlic, that would be okay. If you wanted to put on some garlic salt or something on here, or garlic powder, because I'm already put salt in the jars, you could do that too. Also here next to me, I've got a jar of hot water, because this is a different process. When we do the hot pack, we're cooking the meat, and then we're covering the meat with hot water before we put it in the canner. So I've got my water heating up here. For the liquid, instead of water, you can use broth. If I had drippings from in here, I could use those drippings. I could also use tomato juice, and actually that's one thing that is suggested for like game meats that got a strong flavor. It helps to mellow out the flavor a little more. Okay, so I've got this cooked. Didn't take long to the rare stage. I'm going to use my canning funnel just because some of the fat might drip onto the edge, and this will prevent that. Prevent fat from getting on the sealing edge. I already have my salt in my jar, and as I said before, the salt is optional. Don't even need that. Is there another question? Okay, I just want to make sure there's no big spaces, especially when you got chunks of meat. There can sometimes be large spaces there. So I can get in a few more pieces, and again, kind of avoid the temptation to put in too much. Okay, so I have the jar filled here with a 1-inch headspace, and now I'm going to add the hot water. And you want the hot water going up to the 1-inch headspace. It should be covering the meat. There we go. And what I do with my bubbling tool. This is one of those little canning tools. Like I said, on one side, this tool has the measurements for a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4, 1 inch. Okay. So I got a little more than I need in there. And then when you add I added my liquid, there could be bubbles in there. So this is what they refer to as a bubbling tool. So I'm just putting this bubbling tool down the sides and pulling towards the center. And hopefully any bubbles that are in there will rise to the top.
So we have a question. It says, if I don't have a bubbling tool, what else could I use? Knife, question mark?
A plastic knife. So, you know, any kind of plastic utensil that you have. You just don't want to use anything metal on a canning jar. Because if you're using a canning jar over and over again, over time, those little scratches on the glass from using metal can actually increase the likelihood that your jar will crack. So just don't use metal. I'm wiping the rim with some hot water, putting my lid on, and then the screw band, I do it until it's just fingertip tight. And now this I'm going to bring over to my canner, and these 2 jars are ready to go in the canner. Again, the hot pack, pre-cooked meat with liquid added. The raw pack has no liquid added. You can follow me over to the canner. Okay, as I said earlier, this canner is preheated. So but before I do that, I just want, can you zoom in on this lid? This canner that I'm using is a weighted gauge canner. So this is the weight. Just this, there are different types of weights depending on the brand of canner that you have. This is called a Miro, and you can can at 5 pounds of pressure, 10 pounds of pressure, or 15 pounds of pressure, depending on which hole you choose to put on the canner. So that weight will go on the canner after I vent it, after I get it up to, after I get it up to the right temperature and vent steam out of it. And I have about 2 inches of water in here. When you're doing pressure canning, you don't submerge the jars. The canning process is actually done in a steam environment. So I already have this pre-warmed. I'm putting my pre-warmed jars into the pre-warmed canner with water. I'm just doing 2 jars because that's all I'm doing tonight, but I could fit up to 9 quart or pint jars, up to 9 pint jars or 7 quart jars in this canner. It's also, some canners are tall enough that you can actually double stack. This one, I don't think it's tall enough to double stack. Sorry. Sorry about that. Trying to get that on. I always have to fight with this lid trying to get it on. Which way does this go? Come on. Oh my goodness. That's the way it's going to go. There we go. Oh, I can't get this thing closed. Ah, there, okay. Sorry, that was quite the battle there, trying to get the lid on.
The steam processing, how much water should be in the bottom, 1 to 2 inches? I don't want to run out midway through.
2 inches for a canner. I've never seen more than 2 inches of water in there. Yeah. So that's what I have in here. And so right now I turn the heat up high. And what we want is for this to heat up, and then we're going to see steam coming out of the vent pipe, the vent here. And after that steam starts coming out of the vent right here at the top, after we have a good, what we call a cone of steam coming out, then we vent the canner for 10 minutes. And that's what makes this a steam environment. So the venting evacuates all the air that's in there, and that it does change the temperature that you get. So that's a really important step, is to vent your canner for 10 minutes. So I'm going to be watching this. I'll be coming back to this as I do my presentation. So I'm going to switch now to my other camera. Right, first of all, I just wanted to talk about the difference between that canner and this one. This canner is actually a dial gauge canner because it has this dial which tells you how many pounds of pressure you're at. So you can get at, you don't have to, a weighted gauge canner, you're just canning at 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure. This one you can can, I don't know, I mean, the directions are always for either 11 pounds of pressure, 15 pounds of pressure, so I don't know why you need all these increments, you really don't, but you can actually see on the gauge what the pressure is. These actually, while they're accurate, they're not necessarily reliable. From a science standpoint, that means that the accuracy can vary. So if I dropped this canner lid or something, or if it got a little rusty, this dial might not work correctly. And that's why the National Center for Home Food Preservation and even Presto, the people that make this canner, recommend that you get the dial checked for accuracy every year. You make sure your dial is reading accurately. And here at Cornell Cooperative Extension in Saratoga County, I do test these dials. So if you bring in your lid with your dial, I can test it. I actually have a testing unit from Presto, and I have a dial from them, and I send it back to them every year to be tested. So I know mine is accurate, so I check yours against mine. That's how that works.
We have a question about the meat while that was cooking over there. It says, does the cooked or browned meat have better flavor?
I think it does. You know, I'll get into that a little more with the presentation, but from a quality standpoint, the hot pack is recommended over the raw pack. You might notice also that this has a weight on it, but this is not an adjustable weight. This is what's actually called a counterweight. It's just a way, this would be the vent on this canner lid. This is the vent where we would vent the steam out for 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes, you would put that on, and that's the counterweight, and then the pressure would go up. But the pressure is regulated by the heat of the stove, which is a little different. I mean, a little different on the dial gauge or the weighted gauge canner, which I'm using on my stove. One of the advantages of the dial gauge is that, and I'll show you as I go through the presentation, you'll see at different altitudes, you have to change your pressure. And so when you're using this canner, you can change your pressure by up to 1 pound at a time. You can go from 11 pounds to 12 pounds of pressure. With the other canner, you have to go right from 10 pounds of pressure to 15 pounds of pressure. But that's only if you live over 1,000 feet, then it becomes an issue. In this area, where I live in Saratoga County, there might be a few places that are over 1,000 feet. In Albany County, I know there are some places that are over 1,000 feet. You might live in other places in New York, or not even in New York State, and that might be an issue for you. But when you're canning with your boiling water canning or pressure canning, you should know your altitude. And the important number is 1,000 feet. If you're over 1,000 feet, you might have to adjust. I'm hearing the canner. I'm hearing a lot of steam coming out of there. So I'm gonna let it steam a little more. I think it's just starting to have steam come out. So let's see. Oh, before I go on, I do want to have everybody take my poll. So this is a poll, a little bit about why you're here at the class, and then also some demographics, which is something we're required to collect because Cornell Cooperative Extension is part of the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so because of that, we are required to ask for some demographic information. So if you don't mind doing that, everybody can answer these poll questions for me. me see what you see. Oh, okay, good. I think that's okay. Okay, everybody's doing the poll. Thank you. While you're doing that, I just wanted to show you here that this steam is coming out of the vent, and one way you can tell if you've got a good full head of steam is hold a little piece of paper over it. You see how the paper flies in the air there? I thought I changed the camera. No? What are you seeing there? Are you still seeing?
I'm still seeing your,
my presentation?
hold on. Oh, there.
All right, I had to stop sharing, sorry. Still not sure how all the Zoom stuff works. Oh, and let me close the, are you seeing the, let me close the poll here. Let me see.
Oh, it smells good.
No. And the poll, thank you for doing that. Okay, now we can see the canner. And sometimes it's hard to see if it's really venting, because when it first starts venting, it's just a little bit. But if you can put a piece of paper over it and the paper stands up like that, then you know you've got a good strong head of steam. That's when you start your timing for 10 minutes to steam, to vent your canner for 10 minutes. And again, that is a food safety issue, because if you don't vent it, it's not going to get to the same temperature, and you could have an underprocessed.
So we do have a question and said, would it be safe to can taco filling complete with spices, like ground beef? We do have a recipe for chili, but if you don't have a recipe for it, you really can't just make up a recipe. The integrated webcam. So for taco filling, ground beef taco filling, I see you're talking, yeah, there are canning directions for ground meat. And so you're talking about just adding a few spices. As long as you're not changing the consistency, you know, if you're just adding some taco spice a little bit, that would be okay. But you know, don't go adding beans and adding other vegetables, you know, because you're really getting into a food safety issue once you start changing ingredients. I'm also going to talk a little bit about making soups. So but when you make soups, you just fill it halfway with the solid ingredients and then add your liquid. So we have a question here. Do you have jerky recipes, and do you have jerky recipes is one question.
Yeah, I have jerky recipes. You know, some recipes are in the handout that I gave you, and I'll be going over those.
And the second question is, can you ground turkey and put it in there?
Ground turkey for canning? Yes, yeah, you can can any kind of meat. You can can poultry, pork, veal, venison, bear, squirrel, you know, whatever. Yes, you can. Let's see, I wanted to go to screen share. Okay. All right, before I do my presentation, why isn't that? Anyway, well, I guess I will just do my presentation on pressure canning meat while we're waiting for the canner to vent. What am I doing wrong here? There we go. We're going to talk about why pressure canning is necessary and the principles of safe canning, 2 methods of packing jars. I showed you, hot pack and raw pack, equipment and procedures, and resources. So we can start with resources, which is when it comes to canning anything or for home food preservation, we tell people, because we are part of the USDA, and the National Center for Home Food Preservation is an arm of the USDA. It's actually housed at the University of Georgia. That's why you see the website, uga.edu. So, and the USDA does still do research on food preservation. They come up with new recipes sometimes, and when they do, it'll be on this website here. Or the easier thing to remember is homefoodpreservation.net or homefoodpreservation.com will get you there also. So this is the home page of the National Center for Home Food Preservation. If you're interested in canning, you just go to the How Do I Can section, and that will bring you here, where you can get general information, information on how to use a boiling water canner or a pressure canner. If you're new to canning, you should read the general information. And then how to can fruits, tomatoes, salsa, nuts, vegetables. And then here, if we click here, this is where we would see canning meats.
We have two questions that came in.
Yes.
One is, I raise goats and sheep, no cattle. If I find a recipe for beef, is it safe to use for other beef? Or is it like canning beans versus canning tomatoes?
No, canning any meat is going to be the same. The only difference might be whether or not you want to soak it ahead of time to get some of the stronger flavors out. But as far as the canning times and pressure, that would be the same.
The second question is, if I don't have a gas stove, what are my other options for pressure canning?
You can pressure can on an electric stove. Yeah, it doesn't matter. You don't need a gas stove to pressure can. Okay, this is my website, actually, CCE, Saratoga. If you look under food nutrition and food preservation, I've got a page here where I've put together, I actually have a link to the National Center for Home Food Preservation here. And then I've got a lot of fact sheets. There's tons of information from a lot of other extension organizations. Like one of the handouts I gave you is from Pacific Northwest Extension, which includes Idaho, Washington State, and Oregon. And sometimes all these different extensions, they have their own specialty, or they've come up with a fact sheet that I think is really good. And so I've tried to list some fact sheets here that I think are particularly good. That's fine.
We have another question.
And also down towards the bottom here is Let's Preserve, a fact sheet. Penn State University has a whole series called Let's Preserve that I think are particularly good. So those are linked here. And then I have, if you go to how-to video section, I have about 8 or 9 presentations like this, my PowerPoint presentations that I have pre-recorded. They don't include demonstrations, but for informational purposes, for learning about canning, they're very useful. You might want to check those out. What was the question?
So, only an occasional meat eater here, and the whole concept of meat frazzles me, so apologies if this is the question. But if canning corned beef brisket straight from the package, do you need to also include the contents of the spice packet? So would it be canning it raw?
Would you use the spice? I wouldn't use too much of the spice. I don't know how much spice is in there, but I mean, I assume you want to can it for, for future use. So I'm going to say, you're not going to want to put more than a teaspoon of any kind of, in a pint jar, you're not going to want to put more than a teaspoon of any kind of spices in a jar. And so I'm just not familiar with what kind of spices or how much spice it comes with the corned beef brisket.
Would it depend whether if it was cooked or not?
I'm not sure. I don't understand that question.
Like, if it was already cooked brisket and you were canning it after it was cooked, or versus canning it when it's raw brisket. You see what I'm saying?
I'm wondering why you would want to can already cooked meat, as a, because once you can it, you're cooking it a lot more.
Okay.
But Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding that question. My apologies. Okay, why do I have this slide up here about pH of common canned foods? Because when it comes to canning, we divide foods into two categories, low acid foods and high acid foods. So the low acid foods, which includes all your vegetables, any kind of vegetable, and meats, all meats and vegetables are considered low acid foods, and that means they have to be canned in a pressure canner. A pH of 4.6 is the dividing line between high acid and low acid. Tomatoes are right there at the dividing line. Oh, my timer just went off. That means I got to go check my canner. So I'm going to switch to my other camera. Oh, I have to stop sharing. Okay. So we vented this canner for 10 minutes. So now I want to put the weight on. And once I put the weight on, the pressure is going to start to build up in the canner. So with this canner, because it's got 3 different pressures, I'm choosing the 10 pounds of pressure because that's the pressure I want. So I'm going to put this hole over the vent. Make sure it's sitting on there right. And now the pressure is going to start to build up. I'm starting to put the temperature down just a little bit because I want it to get up to pressure, but I don't want it to be over pressured. It takes some practice getting to know how your stove works with your canner. So for this one, I know I don't want it at full heat because it's going to be too hot. I'll have too much pressure, but we'll come back and check this later once I hear this jiggling, because this canner, according to the directions, you know that it's at the right pressure when we start this, the weight starts to jiggle a little bit, a couple of times a minute. With other brands of weighted gauge canners, I think it's the Presto brand, it's the weight starts to rock a little bit back and forth, and you want a continuous rocking back and forth. I'm not saying I prefer this one over the other one. It's just a matter of getting used to them. They both work equally well. We just happen to have this brand, which is a Miro. I can actually show you, I'm just switching to this camera. So this is a Presto brand, and this is sort of what the Presto weight looks like. Where have I got it here? Yeah. Okay, and when the Presto canner is at the proper pressure, this little thing will wiggle back and forth continuously, and that's how you know. And I'm talking about the Presto weighted gauge canner, so it's not the Presto that has the dial. So it's the weighted gauge canner. So just pretend this isn't here. And that's how you would know that this canner is at the right pressure, because it would just rock gently back and forth constantly. Whereas the Miro brand that I'm using, we have to listen for it to spurt out a little bit of steam a couple times a minute. So I'll go back to that. We're going to be jumping back and forth here. The integrated webcam. Let me go back to screen, sharing my screen. Okay. So again, the acidity of the food is very important in terms of whether or not you're going to have to can it in a boiling water bath canner or a pressure canner. All fruit and acidified foods like sauerkraut or pickles or salsa are or high acid foods, so they can be done in a boiling water canner. Tomatoes are right on the edge, and that's why the USDA did research on tomatoes and found that, you know, to be on the safe side, they recommend adding some lemon juice whenever you're canning tomatoes, just to make sure they're acidic enough to be able to can them in a boiling water canner. Why is this not There we go. Can you guys hear you can hear some steam starting to come out of the canner already. So I'm wondering if I want to turn the temperature down a little more and do that. Because right now I just have a bunch of, the steam is coming out constantly from the weighted gauge here. So I'm going to turn it down some more. And that's going to take a while for the temperature to come down and for the canner to get at the right pressure. Like I said, it does take a little practice if you're new to pressure canning, especially with pressure canning. I would say practice, like maybe put some water in your canner and heat it up just like you had jars in there or something, and bring it up to pressure, heat it up, vent it, put the weight on or the counterweight on, bring it up to pressure, and then adjust your stove to see where on your stove, is it number 1, is it number 2, is it number 8? Where on your stove do you have to have your heat adjusted to get the right pressure? But the amount of heat you need might vary depending on how full your canner is too. So it's always a little bit of playing around with the heat to get it at the right temperature and the right pressure. Okay, so back to my presentation. Why do low acid foods have to be pressure canned to be safe? And of course, it's that one bacteria that we're concerned about, which is Clostridium botulinum, or CBOT, as we like to call it. This bacteria has a very special, ability, and that is, as you're heating it up in the canner, any of the Clostridium botulinum vegetative cells that are in there, they can actually form a protective heat-resistant spore around themselves to protect themselves from being destroyed by heat. And so those spores are not destroyed at 212 degrees in boiling water. So you have to get the temperature up to 240 degrees to destroy those spores. And so that's why it requires pressure canning to get to 240 degrees. What happens if low acid foods are not pressure canned? Well, this Clostridium botulinum can grow, and it needs 4 conditions to grow. It needs a temperature of 140 degrees. I'm sorry, I'll put my phone on mute. And 140 degrees is basically the temperature, room temperature, right? So if we have our canned jars and they're in our cabinets, it's going to be around, room temperature. So bacteria will grow at that temperature. It also needs high moisture content, which of course you have in any kind of canned foods. It needs a low acid environment, which meat and vegetables is a low acid environment. And it needs an oxygen-free environment. And that's what we produce when we're canning. We're evacuating out all the air. We're making that jar is an anaerobic or oxygen-free environment. So then the spores can germinate if they're not killed off during canning, and then that could produce the botulism toxin. Signs and symptoms of botulism. First of all, foods can contain the toxin without showing any signs. So you wouldn't taste it, you wouldn't see it. There is a possibility that if there is enough that has been growing in there for a while, it could actually cause some seeping from the jar. So you might see along the outside of the jar some liquid that's come out from the inside of the jar, because as it's growing, it's creating gas and it's creating pressure, and some liquid will come out. So that's something you should look for anytime you open up some low acid foods that are canned, is whether or not it looks like anything's been leaking out of the jar, or if the lid is bulged at all. If you got a little bulge in your lid, then that might mean that that there's something growing in there creating gases, and that's probably the botulism, the Clostridium botulinum bacteria. But anyway, if you do consume something with botulinum bacteria in it, The symptoms can appear within 12 to 72 hours. It can just be digestive upset, blurred vision, difficulty swallowing and speaking and breathing as it gets worse. And of course, it can kill you. And in 2018, there was a food poisoning related to canned peas in New York City. And all 3 women who ate them were in the hospital for a long time. They were in ICU. They required rehabilitation. They all survived because there is an antidote for it. But you definitely, it's not something you want to get. So this isn't something that happened back in the old days. This is still happening today, botulism food poisoning. So I want to be careful with that. So to prevent the botulism food poisoning, all meats and low-acid foods have to be pressure canned to achieve the temperature of at least 240 degrees. I'm still waiting for my canner to get to the right pressure. I'm not sure if I have it too hot or too cool.
If it's continuously releasing, you like it too hot.
Yeah, I did turn it down a little bit. Okay, we'll wait and listen for that. So these are the 2 different types of pressure canners I was telling you about. The one on the left is the dial gauge canner, and that gauge needs to be checked annually. And this one is a weighted gauge canner. This is a different type of weight than the one I showed you. This is what's called a 3-piece weight. So if you put 1 piece on, it's 5 pounds of pressure. If you put 2 pieces on, it's 10 pounds of pressure. If you put 3 pieces on, it's 15 pounds of pressure. And again, if you have the dial gauge canner, they recommend testing it annually to make sure your gauge is accurate. Some important musts for canning is you should use and follow directions from a reputable source. There's so much information on the internet these days, and we have seen some really unsafe practices recommended on the internet. There are some Facebook groups that, they say right on their Facebook group that they don't follow USDA recommendations. I don't know. They think the USDA is too safe or something, I don't know, but they pride themselves on that. Actually, I had a master food preserver once who was on these Facebook groups, and she was, if she saw something that looked unsafe, she was correcting, and saying, no, according to USDA, this is the right procedure. They kicked her off the group. So the National Center for Home Food Preservation, we recommend. The University of Georgia, that houses the National Center for Food Preservation, they have a book that's called So Easy to Preserve, which I consider kind of like be my food preservation Bible. I always go to that. And that you can purchase that through the National Center for Home Food Preservation website. If you're looking online, searching online, if you are searching, if you do use the word extension and you look for a cooperative extension source, or another source that's an EDU website, then that you can be confident that's a safe recipes. Ball, their blue book has been around for decades, and they have tested all their recipes, so we feel safe in using the older Ball blue book. And just try to use up-to-date methods, and not something that your grandmother used for years. I mean, I have had people say that, oh, actually I met a woman not too long ago who's an older woman, and she's been canning green beans in a boiling water bath for years. But you know what? You also have to, first of all, it's kind of like Russian roulette. Do you know if there's botulism in there? Secondly, to make sure you don't get botulism food poisoning, you have to boil that for 10 minutes. And what are you doing to all the nutrients that are in there when you have to boil it? So use safe methods. Follow your canning steps precisely. If they say to cut it to a certain size, follow the sizes. There are no canning directions for making pumpkin puree. There are canning directions for making cubed pumpkin. But if you decide instead of doing cubed pumpkin, you want to do pumpkin puree, that could be leading to an unsafe product because of the heat transfer in the jar could be different. So there's a lot of factors that go into the recipe, the amount of pressure, or the amount of time they tell you to can for. So you don't want to be changing things. And then make pressure adjustments depending on your altitude. I mentioned that earlier, but here's an example. So this is for, in a dial gauge canner, if you're over 2,000 feet, then you need to increase your pressure by just 1 pound. If you've got a weighted gauge canner and you're over 1,000 feet, then you need to increase your pressure to 15 pounds. So this is where I say, if you are over 1,000 feet, you might want to think about getting a dial gauge canner, because you only have to increase your pressure. Well, you don't have to increase your pressure. The dial gauge, you're always doing at 11 pounds of pressure is what's recommended instead of 10. And so you don't have to adjust that unless you're over 2,000 feet. So let's get on to canning meat. Why can meat? Because it makes the meat very tender. When you open that jar and you cut into that meat, it's very tender. It'll save space in your freezer, and it makes a quick meal. I think I'm going to turn up my stove a little bit. Give me a second here. Okay, at the National Center for Home Food Preservation, you will find directions for canning all these different meats, poultry, seafood, chili con carne they have a recipe for, ground meat, ground or chopped meat, meat in strips, cubes, or chunks, meat stock, meat and vegetable soups, and mincemeat pie. I actually had a call recently from somebody who makes mincemeat pie every year. So when we're canning meat, there's 2 basic packs, which I talked about earlier, the raw pack and the hot pack. And for the hot pack, you're going to pre-cook your meat, either by doing it on the skillet, like I did, browning it, or roasting it, or stewing it. For the raw pack, you're going to want to fill your jars loosely with the raw meat. And this is what I was trying to demonstrate earlier, is if you grasp the jar with one hand and you firmly top the bottom of the jar with the palm of your other hand, that would be loose. That's a loose pack. You don't want to be pushing the meat down into the jar to get as much meat as you can in the jar, because that is going to affect the heat transfer, the heat penetration, and it could lead to an unsafe product if you have too much meat packed in that jar, because the processing time is determined on that meat being loosely filled in the jars. For the hot pack, this is the preferred method. You're going to want to fill your jars with cooked meat and then cover the meat with a hot liquid. I used water, but you could use broth, meat juices, or tomato juice. And as I said earlier, the tomato juice is especially helpful if you've got strong tasting game meat. It'll mellow that a little better. Your hot pack meat will have a better color and flavor. Better flavor because you're pre-cooking it and you've got that little browning on it, which affects the color too. So the salt is optional. And especially if if you're filling the jars with broth or tomato juice, since those are already salty, you wouldn't want to add any extra salt. And don't forget to leave your generous 1-inch head space and wipe the rim of the jar before applying the lid and ring. Let's talk about that head space and why that's important, because it really is. If you have too little head space, you want to get as much into the jar as possible, you want to fill your jar to the top, your food can bubble out during processing, and that can deposit debris, pieces of food, or even fat from the meat on the rim of the jar and get between the sealing surface of the lid and the jar and cause your jar not to seal. If you have too much head space, like 2 inches of head space instead of 1, like you didn't have enough meat to fill a full jar, so you only filled it halfway, the processing time, during the processing time, all of the air might not get evacuated from the jar, and you wouldn't get a steal. And then also, the food at the top is likely to discolor if you have too much headspace. Okay, let's look at the processing time and pressure. So this is the chart that you'd see if you went to the National Center for Home Food Preservation, or after you filled your jars, it's going to tell you how long to process for. So sometimes the processing time varies depending whether you're doing a hot pack or a raw pack. But for meat, it doesn't matter whether you have a hot pack or a raw pack. The processing time does vary depending on if you have pint jars or quart jars. So here it says 75 minutes for pint jars and 90 minutes for quart jars. And then it will tell you how much pressure to use depending on your altitude. I'm gonna put my timer on for canning our meat. Okay, so that would be for every recipe that you have, if you're doing ground meat, you've got different processing times that you'll have. If you're doing the soups or something, there's different processing time. So again, that's for the dial gauge canner. It's giving you the 11 pounds of pressure. For the weighted gauge canner, it's giving you the 10 pounds of pressure. And that goes all the way up to 15 pounds if you're over 1,000 feet. So this is the difference after you've canned meat and it's cooled. These are two jars of, the one on the left is the raw pack. Whoops, sorry. The raw pack. And because you don't add liquid to the raw pack, we're depending on any liquid that's in the meat to kind of cover the meat. And you don't always have that much liquid. So usually you don't have enough liquid. I don't know why they don't add extra liquid so that it does cover the meat, but it's not a food safety issue, but it can be like a quality issue, especially when you got jars that are clear and you can see what's in there. Usually canned meat is sold in metal jars, right? And you can't see what's in there. They just put a pretty picture on the front. So it looks nice. But so like if you're looking at this jar up close, you would see that meat is darker in color than the meat that's under the liquid. And that's just because of oxidation. There might be a little bit of air in here still that's causing that color change. The other thing you notice is that there's a little more fat in the raw pack than in the hot pack. But the hot pack here is all the meat is totally covered with the liquid. And again, that's just a kind of a quality issue. It's not a food safety issue. So whether you do raw pack or hot pack is up to you. The advantage of the raw pack is that it is a little quicker. You're skipping that one step of having to brown the meat. And if you've got lots of meat, that could take up some time. Let me just talk a little bit about game meat. Game meat can have a strong flavor, and that's why a suggestion is to soak the game meat in saltwater brine for an hour before canning, but no longer, just 1 hour. And the brine would be a tablespoon of salt for every 4 cups of water. And you can can your meat as soon as it has cooled. Or if you don't have time for canning now and you want to freeze it first, you can, and then take it out and defrost it, and you can can it at another time. If you are going to do hot pack, the recommendation is to use tomato juice for covering the meat. That will mellow out the flavor. You can also can fish, and there's different ways of doing that. You can have the fish, you can leave the bone in for small fish or remove the bone for larger fish. And again, before canning fish, for flavor's sake, you would want to soak it in a brine for up to an hour. You can can that. There are directions for canning fish in half pint, pint, and quart jars. It used to be only up to pint jars for some reason, but people who live in Alaska eat a lot of fish, so they wanted to be able to can quarts of fish. So the USDA did more research on that and came up with a recipe for canning fish in quarts. And I met someone in one of my food preservation classes. She and her husband go, they do a fishing charter off the coast of Massachusetts every year, and they catch fish and they bring it home and can it. So that saves them money, I guess. For fish, the directions might vary on the type of fish, but they usually recommend the raw pack for fish. For tuna, it does give you the option of raw or hot pack.
We have a question.
Yes.
We have some pint and half jars in the same processing time as the quart jars, question mark. Is this the same processing time as the quart jars for the pint and half jars?
It depends on your recipe. So you would find your recipe, and the one that I just showed you, it had the same processing time for pint and quart jars. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
All right. You can also can soups and stock. And again, these recipes are at the National Center for Home Food Preservation. You can include vegetables, dry beans, or peas that have been rehydrated, meat, poultry, seafood soups. If you're using dried beans or peas, they have to be fully rehydrated first. In the handout I gave you, this handout is from the one on canning, home canning of meats. It's from North Dakota State University, and it does have directions in there for canning soup with dry beans.
We have another question.
Actually, the chili con carne starts with the dry kidney beans. You have to remember that a lot of these kidney beans, a lot of dry beans are grown in North Dakota, so they have a lot of recipes using the dry beans. You have another question?
Yep, it says, sorry if I missed it. What is the shelf life of canned meat?
From a quality standpoint, we recommend that you consume it within a year. All home food preserved foods, we recommend that. But from a food safety standpoint, canned food will remain safe indefinitely as long as the seal is intact, as long as you still have that vacuum seal. How do you know if you have the vacuum seal? Well, if you take the ring off the jar, which you shouldn't store your canned foods with a ring on anyway, and you try to pick the jar up just by holding the lid. If you can pick up a jar from holding onto the lid, you've got a good seal and you've got a safe product indefinitely. If you're making a soup, there is one caution, and that is not to thicken it. You don't want to add any thickener unless it's specified in the recipe, because again, that's going to affect the heat penetration during the canning process, and it will affect the processing and the safety of it. You can salt it to taste as desired. And this is a very important point, is that you would fill your jar halfway with the solid mixture and then fill the rest of it with your liquid. That's what makes a soup. What's the difference between a soup and a stew? I always, it's actually the amount of liquid. So you can't can stew because you don't have enough liquid. And the amount of liquid affects how heat penetrates, how heat, gets, and it's all scientifically based. So just follow, if you're gonna do soup, just make sure you're only putting your solid up to halfway in the jar and the rest of it is liquid. And so here would be your directions for canning soup. Again, it's always going to be hot pack. For pint jars, it's going to be 60 minutes. For quart jars, it's going to be 75 minutes. So there are some things that are the same processing time, whether it's pints or quarts. But if it shows a difference, you use the processing time that's recommended here. Unless your soup contains seafood, then it would be 100 minutes. I don't know why. You have to process meat, fish a lot longer than meat. which seems counterintuitive to me because it doesn't seem as dense, but I don't know. That's the rule. And then storing canned foods, you would want to label and date your foods. I usually just label it right on the top of the lid because I'm going to be throwing out my lid anyway. Nope. You want to use it within a year for best quality, and it will remain safe indefinitely. And you can see that these jars are being stored without the rings. Why is that? Because if you leave the rings on, first of all, the rings aren't needed. The lid is being held in place by the vacuum seal. If you leave the lids on there, or the rings on there, and you're in a moist environment, like anywhere in the Northeast, the rings will rust. They're not made of stainless steel, so they're going to rust. So take the rings off, make sure they're nice and clean and dry, thoroughly dry. Put them in a plastic bag. That's the best way to keep them from rusting.
So we have a question.
Yeah.
Says the NDSU handout says mayonnaise type jars are not recommended for use in fresh food. Why exactly is that? What exactly is a mayonnaise type jar?
A mayonnaise type jar. So that would be a jar that any kind of jarred food that you get in a grocery store is not necessarily a mason jar. A mason jar or a canning jar is thicker. Those mayonnaise type jars are thinner, and so they're much more likely to break. Also, your canning lid, the lid and the ring won't necessarily fit on those jars. There are some, like I've seen tomato sauces that are actually sold in a mason jar, so you could reuse those. But check the size also, because a lot of those that you think are quart jars are not quite quart. A quart's 32 ounces, and sometimes those tomato sauce jars that are in a mason jar, a thicker jar, are only like 26 ounces, which would be okay, but you would still have to process it for the amount of time for a quart jar. So it would just be processed a little longer than need be because you've got less in there. So I hope that answers that question, but that's a good question. Obviously, you've been looking at the handout. Okay, okay. So for resources, I use the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Penn State University does have one on Let's Preserve Soup. So they've got some more recipes there. And the University of Alaska canning the fish you catch. Here's my email address, dwitten@cornell.edu. Feel free to email me after the class with any questions that you might have regarding canning meat. And I'm going to close out that presentation. I stopped share that. Let's see. I want to go over this. Screen share. Okay. So this is the North Dakota State University handout on canning meats. Again, I thought it was just really well done. That's why I included it. Just some general procedures for you. I'm using a canner. Keep going back and forth. Down here is where they talk about how to do a loose pack, or that fill the jars without getting them too full. That technique of using the palm of your hand to kind of pack the meat down. They have their map of North Dakota for altitude adjustments, but you can check your altitude. Obviously online, you can check your altitude if you don't know it. The National Center for Home Food Preservation does have a link to an altitude guide, but you can pretty much Google that and find it. What the heck happened here? All right, I'm trying to go down to the next page. There's a processing error. What's going on here? Okay. So So I can't show you this handout, but you all have that. It includes directions on canning chicken or rabbit, ground or chopped beef, meat stock, chili con carne, fish, and soups. Okay. All right, I'm gonna, all right. I'm going to talk about making meat jerky now. So does anyone have any more questions about canning? Okay, so this is the handout you have for making meat jerky at home safely.
Oh, there was a fun fact put into the chat.
Oh.
It says the Compass app on the iPhone will show you your elevation.
Okay, thank you. All right, so jerky is probably the oldest method of food preservation. There's evidence of that you know, the native people dehydrated meat going way back over 1,000 years, whereas canning is only 200 years old. So people have been making jerky for a long time, since the early Egyptian civilizations. And the North American Indians mixed ground dried meat with dried fruit or suet to make pemmican. They were known for strips of meat in the sun for over the fire with smoke to make charky, which became known as jerky. That's where the word is kind of a bastardization of the original word. And with making jerky, you really want to be careful with food safety because there have been outbreaks of salmon, Escherichia coli, E. coli outbreaks attributed to jerky. So I'm going to show you a couple of different methods for making jerky safely at home. I've got a presentation I'm going to be doing, but it's all based on this fact sheet. So we'll come back to this later. For right now, I want to show you some dehydrators. So Nicolina, if you can switch, or I'll switch the camera. Oh, sorry. And we'll go back over here.
It's not showing yet.
No?
So I'll get it set up.
Oh, that's because I am sharing. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. Okay, so over here, I have two different styles of dehydrators. Two basic styles of dehydrators are kind of the square or rectangular shaped or the round shape. Probably all of you have seen the bigger round one. It's usually white. Those are probably available at lots of garage sales because people were buying them like crazy back in the 70s and 80s, and now they're all at garage sales. I tend to prefer this shape better though, the rectangular or square shape. So if you're looking to buy a new one, I would recommend that over the round one. But there are other important features that you want to look for in a dehydrator. One is a heat source. In the Northeast, we don't recommend solar drying, except for a few exceptions, like with herbs that are going to dry really quickly. But when it comes to meat, absolutely not. No solar drying in the Northeast. It would have to be over, in the Northeast, if they dried meat 1,000 years ago, it would have been over a fire. So you need a heat source. So your dehydrator, you're going to want a heat source, which this is the most basic dehydrator. It does have a heat source there, which is good. The one thing that this doesn't have is it doesn't have a fan. This dehydrator here has a big fan in it. And this fan, it actually draws the air, well, I guess the fan's in the back, so it draws the air through the trays, across the trays, as opposed to the round one, the big round one, that's got a fan on the bottom, either bottom or top, it's got the fan, and it causes the air to go through the trays. So you don't get as even a drying as you do with these, because the air is going across all the trays evenly. If you've got a full dehydrator, it's going to dry pretty evenly. I know people who have those round dehydrators, and they always say you have to, during the dehydrating process, they kind of rotate the trays. They take the top off, they put the top tray on the bottom, because, to try to get it to dry a little more evenly. So that's why that's one of the big reasons why I do prefer this type of dehydrator that allows the air to cross the fans in the back, as opposed to being on the top. The other thing to look for in a dehydrator is temperature control. So this one does have a heating element, but it doesn't have any temperature control. Whereas this one, move that over here. This one has a little control over here, which you can just go from low, which is what you would use for herbs, to medium, which you would use for fruits and vegetables, to high is what you would use for canning meat. I guess I'd say the Cadillac models of dehydrators also have a timer, because sometimes, things are going to need to dry for 8, 12 hours, and let's say you have time at night to fill your dehydrator, but you're not going to be up to turn it off in time. You can set a timer. You can jerry-rig your own timer, like we all do with our Christmas lights. You just, buy one of those timer things that you can put in the plug in your wall and plug this into that, so that you can create a timer. So dehydrators always come with trays, and then they also come with a sheet like this. And this is specifically, mostly for making like a fruit leather. You don't need that for making jerky. But if you buy a new dehydrator, it will come with both the open trays and the sheet. Another reason why I like the square shape as opposed to the round is that if you are doing a fruit leather, if you want to use this dehydrator to do a fruit leather, it's easier to spread it on this open surface than it is on the round tray that's got the hole in the center, because that's where the air flow happens. I just find it's harder to work around that hole, and I just think that the shape is more efficient. If you've got a lot of meat, you can put it on there, stack the meat on there without that. And so I'm not going to bother telling you what brand this is, because they're not making this brand anymore. So, and it doesn't matter what brand you get, just shop around and look for those three features. You want a timer, you want a heat source, obviously, you want a variable temperature, and a timer. Then people ask, can they do it in their oven? And that really, kind of yes, kind of no, it depends on your oven maybe. First of all, no ovens go down, the temperature you're looking for is like 145 to 155 degrees, and no ovens go that low. So you might have, it's going to dry. What happens if it's too hot is it dries out the surface of the meat before the inside is dehydrated. And then you'll get, then you can have bacteria, or, that will survive. Molds can survive on the inside of the meat. You get, if you are going to try to do it in your oven, you can try to prop your door open a little, your oven door open a little, and put a fan by it, and kind of monitor the temperature so that you might be able to get a good temperature. But with my oven, I've got a newer oven. If my door is open, it turns off. So it's not even possible. I can't even do that. Okay, I'm going to go back and show you the presentation. that I have on making jerky. Okay, making jerky at home safely. Food safety obviously is a big issue because we're dealing with meat, which if it's at room temperature for more, or if it's under 140 degrees for more than 2 hours, it can be a real food safety hazard and you could get foodborne illness. So we definitely want to prevent that. So here we're going to learn about factors affecting quality, 3 methods for safe jerky, choosing a dehydrator, judging dryness, and then the resources. I already went through these resources with you, except at the National Center for Home Food Preservation. If you click on how do I dry food, it's information about dehydrators, making fruit leathers, dehydrating all kinds of food, including meats. And that's my website. So jerky, obviously it's a nice lightweight dried meat product, handy for backpackers or campers, hunters and outdoor enthusiasts. And it's also a nutrient-dense source of protein. Proper drying of jerky removes most of the moisture, making it shelf stable, and it requires no refrigeration. 16 ounces of meat, of raw meat, will make about 4 ounces of jerky. Jerky can be made from almost any lean meat, including beef, pork, venison, or smoked turkey breast. Raw poultry is generally not recommended because it doesn't, the texture comes out kind of weird. But any meat can be dehydrated. It's just the quality. Apparently, poultry doesn't dry real well. I'm not quite sure why. Fish jerky, you can even do that. Choose a non-oily fish, more likely to become rancid. And you would want to store it in your refrigerator or freezer anyway. So drying is the oldest method of food preservation since ancient Egyptian times. I already talked about that. There have been several foodborne illness outbreaks since the mid-90s that have been traced to homemade jerky due to Escherichia coli, E. coli contamination. So research was done showing that traditional jerky preparation methods don't destroy pathogens. If those pathogens are present in the meat, and you just dry the meat at 140 to 155 degrees, you're not guaranteed you're going to destroy all the potential foodborne illness bacteria. Ground meats are particularly challenging from a food safety standpoint. So basically the 3 premises of food safety are to clean, make sure when you're making jerky you've got clean surfaces, clean hands. Separate, meaning that if you're cutting up meat, use a different cutting board than you use with your vegetables. This is just in general for home, for anytime you're cooking at home. But particularly some jerky food safety is the biggest concern is E. coli, but you could also have problems with salmonella and trichinella parasite, especially in pork and game meats. Jerky can be considered done and safe when it's heated sufficiently to destroy all pathogens and dry enough to inhibit mold growth so that it's shelf stable. Trichinella can be found in wild game and pork. It's a parasitic worm. And so to kill the trichinella prior to dehydrating, so if you have game meat or pork, you should freeze. You should have it cut into so that it's no thicker than 6 inches thick and freeze it at 0 degrees or below for at least 30 days. That would kill that parasite if it is in the meat. Deer carcass should be rapidly chilled to avoid bacterial growth. When you're slicing the meat, you can slice it no thicker than 1/4 inch thick. And raw meat will be easier to slice if it's partially frozen. So if you freeze your meat first and you defrost it, as soon as you can cut it, that's when you want to cut it. Because especially you saw, you've all cut meat and you know how it's hard to cut it at the right thickness. And if you're making jerky, you're trying to get it at a really specific thickness. So it's definitely easier to do it if it's partially frozen. It's kind of tricky to get it right at that point, but if you can, it'll help you cut it into a uniform thickness, which makes a big difference when it's dehydrating, to get it to dehydrate all at the same time. For a chewy jerky, you want to slice it with the grain of the meat, and for a tender jerky, you can slice it across the grain. It's going to be more tender because you're cutting across all that, all those protein tissues, fibers, and so you don't have to chew it as much, and so it's a little more tender. You can make jerky with ground meat. There is a special jerky gun on the market for doing something like that. It makes a very tender jerky, of course, and you would want to use a very low-fat meat. And obviously, you can season it, but you're not going to marinate it like you would other jerky. If you don't have a jerky gun, you can roll out your ground meat and then just cut it. Roll it out with a rolling pin and cut it into pieces. You're going to want to marinate your meat. This is partially mostly for flavor. And so you would place your strips of meat in a shallow pan or plastic food bag and marinate it for however long, a couple hours, maybe overnight. These are the ingredients for a typical marinade. It might have some spices like onion and garlic in it, and then some soy sauce, maybe some pepper, maybe some fresh garlic, things like that. There's a lot of different recipes for marinade. And that is the food dehydrator I was talking about earlier, the round food dehydrator. That was very popular back in the 70s and 80s. So for making a safe meat jerky, there are 3 different methods. One is to pre-cook the meat before you dry it. Another one is to heat the meat after you dry it. And the third one is to do the vinegar soak. So I'm going to talk about those. I gave you this fact sheet, which describes all 3 of these methods. So method 1 is to pre-cook the meat, and there's 2 ways to pre-cook it. One is to heat the slices or strips of raw meat by dipping in a hot brine. And the other is to bake the meat. So this would be an example of dipping the meat in the boiling marinade. Heat 1 or 2 cups of marinade of your choice to boiling, add a few strips of meat at a time, and then simmer the meat for 1.5 to 2 minutes. And that would be long enough to heat the meat to 160 degrees. Then you would take it out of there and you would drain it and then you could put it on your dehydration tray. You could pat it dry first, and always preheat your dehydrator. So you want the dehydrator to be at 145 degrees as soon as you put the meat in, so it doesn't take time to preheat. The other way to preheat the meat is to bake it in the oven. Obviously, you're going to use that for ground meat because you can't dip it in the marinade. So preheat the oven to 325 and heat the strips of meat until they reach 160 degrees, which is tricky to do because how do you test, you have to have a special thermometer for doing this. Basically, a really thin-tipped thermometer so that you can take the temperature of the meat. Because we don't have a time here. We're not saying, heat it at 325 for 15 minutes. So you really need to have that special, an instant read meat thermometer to check the temperature of the meat. The easier method is to heat your meat after dehydrating. So you would go through the dehydration process. And then this is kind of like, I think of it as a pasteurization method. So you would put your dried meat strips on a baking tray, put it in the oven at 275 for 10 minutes. So if you're using any kind of marinade that you have and you want to dehydrate it first, and I just think this is probably the easiest method to do. After it's dehydrated, stick it in the oven for 10 minutes, and basically you're pasteurizing it. The third method is the vinegar soak method, which is really interesting. This really changes the flavor of the meat, which personally I like the flavor of vinegar, so I like this method. But it's not recommended for game meats unless they're frozen first, which they should be anyway. As I discussed earlier, they should be kept at 0 degrees for 30 days so that you're killing off the trichinosis that might be there. So for this one, you're going to soak the meat in vinegar, just pure vinegar, for 10 minutes. So if you've got your meat sliced thin, and you make sure that the vinegar is in contact with all the meat, so mix it up, put it in a plastic bag or in a bowl like this, and that's all you need to do is soak it for 10 minutes. You're acidifying the meat. So by acidifying the meat, it's making it safer to dehydrate. So that is your only food safety step that you need to do. If you do this method, you don't need to preheat it. You don't need to heat it afterwards. So you would just discard your vinegar, and then you would marinate the meat according to the directions you have in your marinade for 1 to 24 hours.
So we do have a question. It says, tips for getting the marinade into the meat when doing the plastic bag overnight approach.
Tips for getting the marinade into the meat? Well, since it's sliced thinly, there's going to be a lot of surface area, so that helps. And just move the marinade around in the bag to make sure that it's in contact with all the meat. So it shouldn't be a problem. You just don't want all the meat stacked up on itself, so just mix the marinade in. For dehydrating, like I said, you want to preheat your dehydrator to 145, put it on high. This dehydrator here, notice how it actually has temperatures. It says 110, 125, 145. My dehydrator just has low, medium, and high. So I use high when I'm dehydrating meat. So have it preheated so that the dehydration process can start as soon as you put the meat in. That case hardening that we're talking about there, that happens if it's too hot. Usually that's not going to happen in a dehydrator. It will happen in an oven. If an oven is too hot, the case hardening is when the outside dries before the inside dries. And when that happens, the moisture that's in the meat can't escape because the outside of the meat has already dried. And that can cause foodborne illness problems. You might want to spray your tray before you put the meat on so it doesn't stick, and then arrange your meat strips on drier trays close to but not touching each other. You want air to be able to circulate all around the meat, so give a little space there in between your pieces. This shows I've got the two different methods here. The one on the left is that's marinated meat that has not been pre-cooked. This is the vinegar soak method. And then I pat it dry before I put it in the dehydrator. And then on the right-hand side is the meat that was pre-cooked. You can kind of see the difference in color too. When you pre-cook it, made it a little grayer looking. So yeah, you don't want, it doesn't have to be spaced that far apart, but you just don't want it touching. Try to arrange similar sized pieces on the same racks, just because they'll dry at different rates. So if you have them all in the same rack, you don't have to pick out what pieces are dry and which aren't. You can just remove one tray. If it dehydrates, those pieces are smaller and they dehydrate faster than the other tray. The drying time is about 4 hours for making jerky. But if you do the pre-cooked method, it will dry a little faster. How do you know when jerky is done? It should be chewy and leathery. So you can see when they're showing bending that piece of jerky, it should bend kind of like a green stick and not snap. I mean, it can't be too dry. It might be a little tougher to eat if it's too dry, but it's not a problem if it's too dry. It's a problem more if it's not dry enough. So if you want to, if you want to dry it just as much as you need to dry it, then you shouldn't see any kind of damp spots on there. And when you bend it, it might still be flexible. Conditioning is the final step of dehydrating, whether you're dehydrating meats or vegetables or fruits. A lot of people skip this step, but it's an important step. Conditioning helps to distribute the moisture evenly in pieces of jerky. So let's say you have a part of your meat was a little thicker than another part that was thinner. If you put your meat in a bag like this or in a jar, and you don't want to you want air to be in there. You want there to be room. You want there to be room for the meat to move around. You want the air that's in the bag to be able to circulate, so that if there's extra moisture in a thicker piece of meat, it will eventually be taken up by the drier meat. And this is going to take about 2 or 4 days. So just do this conditioning, put it in the bag, shake the bag around a few times over the course of the next few days.
So we have a question, and in regard to the damp spots, it just says damp spots, question mark, like, what do you mean by damp spots in the meat when you're checking it?
Well, like if you take a paper towel and sometimes you can actually see a little bit of oil or a damp spot on the meat. If you take a paper towel and you pat it and there's any moisture that comes off of it, it's not dry enough. So the amount of time it takes to dry, it's not an exact science. We can't tell you it's 4 hours exactly, because drying might depend on the humidity. If it's a real humid day, it's going to take a little longer to dehydrate than if it's a real dry day.
Thank you.
And then the temperature in the meat and the temperature of the room could affect how quickly it dries too. So the final step with your jerky is to label it, put it in an airtight plastic bag. As much air as you can get out as possible is always good. I always say air is kind of the enemy of food preservation because it oxidizes things. Air would cause meat to go rancid. I mean, not meat, would cause the fat in the meat to go rancid. So the plastic bags are really best because you can try to get all the air out as you can. If you have a vacuum sealer, that's even better. They do make these vacuum sealers for jars. It's a special lid that you put on a jar and it can vacuum out, but you need a lot of those lids if you want to do it in a jar. You can also buy in the store, not in the store, you can buy online the little packets that absorb moisture. And if you can put some of those packets, and usually when you buy jerky in the store, you'll see those packets in there, and that's to absorb moisture. They also have oxygen absorbing packets, but usually the ones that they're using are the moisture absorbing packets. What else do I want to say? And then for storing, if you don't enjoy it and eat it right away, you want to store it in a cool, dark place and dry location. To maintain best quality by storing at room temperature, the best quality, it'll keep for 2 weeks. In the refrigerator, best quality will be 3 to 6 months. In the freezer, up to a year. You might say, I'm dehydrating it so I don't have to put it in the refrigerator or the freezer, right? Well, that's true, and it'll stay safe at room temperature. But we're talking about best quality. And dehydrated food doesn't take up a lot of space. So if you want to really improve the best quality, you can put it in your freezer. Just a suggestion, but obviously don't have to. So things to be careful of when you're making jerky is to make sure your hands are clean, your work surfaces are clean, you're avoiding cross-contamination, you've preheated your dehydrator, and make sure it's not too hot to avoid case hardening. You'll cool it to room temperature before packaging. Don't skip that conditioning step of the meat before storing, and then store it in a cool, dark, dry conditions. The equipment that you're going to need, obviously, is a dehydrator is best. Oven, if you don't have a dehydrator, it could be possible. And the most efficient way of doing it is obviously in a dehydrator. Different shapes and sizes I talked about. There's another brand of the square one that's different from mine. These are the dehydrator features I already talked about, having a heating element, a thermostat, a fan, drying trays. Some of them do have double wall. I guess they're just more efficient in terms of heat if they have that double wall. Some of them do have the auto shut-off timer. And you can get some really, the sizes really vary. How much money do you want to spend? I mean, I've seen some really big ones at like farms that are trying to do lots of apples. Like they're trying to dehydrate lots of apple rings, so they've got really large ones. So depending on how much you want to do, how much you want to spend, but just look for that UL seal and at least a 1-year guarantee. Again, these are the two different shapes and sizes. The horizontal one, the airflow, the heat and the airflow are on the side or on the back. So it reduces the mixing of flavors. Sometimes people want to use the dehydrator to dehydrate different vegetables or fruits at the same time. And you might get some mixing of flavor with the vertical, the round one. Also with the rectangular one, the horizontal one, the heating element is also on the back. And so you don't have to worry about anything dripping onto the heating element, especially like when you're doing herbs, as it dries, it might flake and some of the herbs might fall through the tray and get onto the heating element. But price, they might be a little more pricey than the vertical airflow, the rounder vertical airflow dehydrators. There is a thing called freeze drying, and it's pretty amazing, actually. Freeze-dried food is, it maintains the same, it doesn't shrink in size. It's really interesting. I had some people, at one of my food preservation classes, I met a woman, they have a dehydrator. They have their own freeze dryer. I mean, it's very expensive. I wouldn't even think about buying it, but she and her husband are really into, having lots of food stored for an emergency. And they decided to buy this freeze dryer. They had the money for it. And so it is kind of a disadvantage. I mean, one of the advantages of dried food is that it shrinks and it takes up less space. But when you freeze dry, it maintains its original size. The advantage is that it removes 99% of moisture, retains 97% of nutrients versus only maintaining 60% of nutrients in a typical dehydrator. You'll have a better, the flavor is better. The food will weigh less because there's less moisture in it, and it has a much longer shelf life. So that is something I wanted to let you know. These are on the market, and if you've got money to spare, you might prefer a freeze dryer over a dehydrator. So I gave you some resources for future reference. So I think that